Hello and welcome to Byju's Exam Prep IAS. Welcome to another session of Indian Economy Essentials, and in today's video, let's have a discussion regarding the recent drop of petrol bomb by the Pakistani government on its people. Now, some of you looking at the title of the PPT or title of the video, please understand this, will be worried what kind of a bomb is it. But please be very careful. The concept of a petrol bomb is not literally a bomb. Rather, it represents a huge or a steep rise in the prices of the commodity. Now, let's have a discussion. Have a look at the article here. There are two very important points for you to make a note of. One, Sri Lankan government, ESL, Sri Lankan government has announced that they will supply steady power, that is uninterrupted power would be supplied to the people without any interruption henceforth, but with one condition. The prices of the energy or electricity has been increased by 66%. This is not the first time that the Sri Lanka has actually increased the price. Earlier also in the last year, it had already increased the price of electricity by 70%. So second time this has been done. And on the other hand, there is one more very important article. The government of Pakistan has announced that they would be increasing the price of the petrol and many other fuel commodities by a huge margin. And because they have increased the price of the petrol by a huge margin, by a large number like this, it will have a big impact on the consumers in the market. And because this has a devastating impact on the consumers, it is referred to as petrol bomb. Now some of you will be confused. Sir, why two articles in one, right? Basically one newspaper related to two different countries. The context is very simple. Both of these countries are suffering and there are certain economic crises or there are certain parameters which can be referred to as an economic crisis in both of the countries. And whenever there are issues such as BOP crisis, the member countries of IMF approach IMF. They want to borrow from IMF. Simple. The BOP crisis is there. The countries will go to IMF and they want to borrow from IMF. Now some of you will simply say, sir, if they want to borrow from IMF, agreed there's a crisis in both the countries, they want to borrow, but why are they increasing the electricity price and why is the other country increasing the petrol and diesel prices? The reason is very simple. Whenever the IMF will provide the bailout like this or financial assistance like this, the IMF will impose certain conditions. You will have to remember this particular terminology now. IMF imposes conditions. The reason IMF imposes conditions is very simple. Imagine there is a country whose forex reserves have depleted. The amount of revenues earned by the government in this country have gone down. The deficit is at all time very high. The expenditure of the government is also very, very high. Now imagine you are the IMF governor or you are basically running IMF. Imagine that. Now you tell me, this member country will come to you, approach you and say that they want assistance from you. Will you simply provide assistance without ensuring that there is turnaround or there are certain important reforms which are implemented by the country? If you say that, sir, I will give them the assistance without any conditions, then you are giving loan to a country, you are giving money to a country which will simply spend without generating sufficient amount of revenue, thereby again falling into further crisis. What about your money then? That is a precise reason. Remember this carefully. Whenever any country approaches IMF for an assistance like this, especially whenever there is a structural problem in the economy, there is a BOP crisis in the economy, the IMF will impose conditions. Now what is the crisis in both of these countries? Simple. In Sri Lanka, the debt of the government is very high. The government is unable to repay the borrowings that they have done from the foreign market. The forex reserves have depleted. Inflation rate is very high. And the same parameters you can simply attribute to one more neighbor of India, that is Pakistan. The forex reserves have fallen to such a very low level. The import cover is less than a month. The import cover is somewhere around 3 weeks now. Inflation rate has gone beyond 20%. Many of the months they have recorded 24%, 27% inflation rate. They are struggling to bring in imports. Manufacturing is getting affected. Unemployment rate is increasing. Government expenditure is also very high. Now looking at all of this, both of these countries approached IMF, and when they have approached IMF has stated, I will give you the assistance. The bailout package has been provided for both of these countries. Certain amount is given. Don't worry, do not buy heart it, not necessary. But IMF says, if you want these or if you want this much amount of money, you will have to implement certain reforms. For example, you will have to ensure that you will be able to collect more and more amount of revenue. You will have to ensure that you will be able to bring in lot of amount of money in the form of foreign exchange. For example, remittances. You will have to ensure that you will cut your expenses or expenditure, etc. In that context itself, both the government of Sri Lanka, which has increased the electricity rates, as well as the Pakistan government, which has announced a mini budget. I hope you understand this. They have announced a mini budget, and in the mini budget, most of the announcements are related to taxes itself. And government there in the Pakistan has stated, with implementation of all of these taxes, the government will be able to collect somewhere around 170 billion rupees from the people, thereby showing to IMF that we are able to generate revenues. Now that is point number one. Point number two. Now some of you will ask, what is the use of it then? Why is the IMF even giving assistance with so much amount of conditions? Reasons are following. One, a country which is always or which is already in the crisis will get the assistance from IMF. Now don't you think, if IMF will provide certain package in various tranches, in various rounds to Pakistan as well as let's say to Sri Lanka, don't you think the impact of the economic crisis will be blunted? That is, the impact will be reduced. That's the first very important point. Second, I said IMF will provide the loans but with conditions like this. Now if IMF will start providing money to both Pakistan as well as Sri Lanka, what does it mean? It simply means both the countries are implementing certain structural reforms. And when countries are implementing structural reforms, you tell me, don't you think other countries will have more faith or confidence in the performance of this economy? And don't you think that will help countries which are there in crisis to borrow money, to take more amount of money from other countries as well? That's the second very important point. Third very important point. There is a concept called as a contagion effect. Right? What is this idea of a contagion effect? Imagine a simple example here. Imagine there are two countries, A and B. A is exporting goods or services to country B. There's a trade relation. Now imagine country B will incur huge amount of, let's say, depletion in forex reserves. Inflation rate is very high. Unemployment rate is increasing, etc., etc., etc. And the government of country B will default. Now, simple question to you. If the government of country B defaults, the economy is in crisis, in shambles, don't you think the trade relation between A and B would be disrupted, would be affected? Which means the exports from country A would also be disrupted. It could lead to certain issues and lead to, let's say, lower earnings, higher unemployment rate, because let's say the exporting companies in country A will start removing the number of employees. And that will have a huge amount of impact on other countries which have trade relations with, let's say, country A. This in simple terms is referred to as a contagion effect or a spillover effect. So in order to ensure that all these three issues are addressed, generally IMF will come forward and provide assistance to the member countries like this. Now, next very important point, some of you will ask me this. So let's say IMF will provide the loan or assistance. How does IMF know that the countries are implementing reforms. Simple point. Generally, whenever IMF will provide the assistance like this, it will not provide in a single lump sum amount. These are issued in tranches. I'll use a technical term here. These are issued in tranches. Tranches in simple terms, rounds. And generally IMF will conduct certain surveys or analysis. For example, there is a term called as QPC, quantitative performance criteria. There is something called as IT, indicative targets, and one more, SB, structural benchmark. So IMF says, I will keep on evaluating your performance under each of these, and if I feel that you're not implementing the reforms correctly, we'll stop the assistance. This is how IMF will ensure that member countries which are in distress will get assistance, also ensure that reforms are implemented. Now, is there any criticism against it? Is there any problem related to this kind of, let's say, the practice followed by IMF? There are many experts who view that whenever IMF will provide the assistance, it imposes such conditions, thereby making the crisis much higher. That is, intensity of the crisis is going to increase in such a country. For example, I told that in Pakistan the inflation rate is already very high, and to appease, or let's say to basically satisfy conditions of IMF, the government of Pakistan has dropped the petrol bomb on the citizens of the country. That is, increase the prices of petrol and diesel. Now you tell me, if the prices of petrol and diesel suddenly rise up in the market, will it not again cause inflation? Will it not have an impact on the growth prospects of the economy? Answer is yes. So these are the various aspects related to the reforms that are being implemented by both Sri Lanka as well as Pakistan to satisfy the conditions of IMF. Now, if you like the initiative that we have launched for you, please hit the like button. And if you're yet to subscribe to Byju's Exam Prep IAS, kindly do it now. Thank you. Have a great day.